The crystal chandelier of Aurelia wept light onto tables draped in starched white linen. It was a place where fortunes were made and unmade over plates of seared foie gras and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. Tonight, the fortune being forged belonged to Alistair Finch. He sat at the restaurant's most coveted table, a corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the entire dining room. His suit was a custom-tailored Tom Ford, the color of a midnight sky, and his watch, a Patek Philippe Grand Complications, was a subtle but obscene declaration of his wealth. Across from him sat Mr. Tanaka and his two associates, the Japanese delegation that held the key to Alistair's multi-billion-dollar energy merger. Alistair was a predator in a world of sharks, and tonight he was closing in on the kill. Every detail had to be perfect. The wine, a 1982 Chateau Margaux, had been decanted an hour prior. The conversation was a delicate dance of flattery and veiled negotiation. Alistair exuded a confident, almost suffocating charm, but beneath it a wire of tension was pulled taut. This deal would elevate him from a mere billionaire to a titan, a name whispered with the same reverence as Rockefeller or Carnegie. He would not tolerate a single flaw in the tapestry of this evening. Then she appeared, the waitress. Her name tag read Elena. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost invisible. A ghost in a simple black uniform. She was unremarkable, with plain brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of a stormy sea. There was a stillness about her that was unusual. While other staff scurried with nervous energy, she glided, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She approached their table to refill their water glasses, her movements fluid and practiced. Alistair was in the middle of a sentence, a carefully crafted anecdote designed to impress Mr. Tanaka with his global reach. As Eleanor leaned forward, her hand steady, a single errant drop of chilled water escaped the lip of the silver pitcher. It fell, a tiny, insignificant bead, landing on the glossy surface of Alistair's deal prospectus, which lay beside his plate. The drop smeared a tiny fraction of an inch of ink on a subclause number. It was nothing, a speck, a non-event in any sane universe. But Alistair's universe was not sane. It was a world built on the fragile foundation of absolute control. The drop of water was a crack in that foundation. His smile, a moment ago so broad and predatory, vanished. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging his features into a mask of cold fury. Mr. Tanaka and his associates stopped talking, sensing the sudden Arctic chill. "What?" Alistair said, his voice dangerously low, not looking at the waitress, but at the glistening speck on his paper. "Do you think you are doing?" Eleanor froze, the pitcher still in her hand. She saw the drop, and a flicker of apology crossed her face. "My apologies, sir. It was an accident." "An accident?" Alistair's voice rose slightly, laced with theatrical disbelief. He finally lifted his eyes to her, and they were like chips of ice. "An accident? You think incompetence is an excuse? I am in the middle of the most important meeting of my life, and you, with your clumsiness, have just defaced a critical document." He was performing, turning a minor mishap into a demonstration of his power, a show of how even the smallest imperfection in his orbit would be ruthlessly punished. It was a message for Mr. Tanaka. "I am a man who commands perfection." Eleanor's professional mask remained in place, though a faint flush crept up her neck. "I am truly sorry, sir. I can get you a cloth immediately." "A cloth?" Alistair laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A cloth will not fix your ineptitude. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you know what this dinner costs? It costs more than you make in a year. A year of your pathetic, meaningless life, serving water to people who actually matter." The cruelty was deliberate, designed to shatter her composure. Other diners were beginning to stare, their conversations faltering. The restaurant manager, a man named Marcus with a perpetually worried expression, began to hurry over, his face pale. Eleanor simply stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "There is no need for insult, sir. It was a drop of water." Her calmness was gasoline on his fire. He wanted her to cry, to beg, to grovel. Her dignity was a silent rebellion he could not tolerate. "No need?" he snarled, pushing his chair back slightly. "I'll tell you what there's a need for. There's a need for standards. There's a need for competence. And you, my dear, have neither." He turned his head as Marcus arrived, breathless, at the table. "Marcus, I want her gone." Marcus wrung his hands, his eyes darting between the furious billionaire and the stoic waitress. "Mr. Finch, sir, please. I am so sorry for this disturbance. Perhaps a complimentary bottle of champagne for the table." "I don't want champagne," Alistair snapped, his voice now loud enough to carry across the room. "I want her fired. I want her out of my sight, now. Or I will not only never dine in this establishment again, I will personally buy this building and turn it into a parking garage. Am I understood?" The threat was absurd, but the venom behind it was real. Marcus wilted. He looked at Elena, his expression a mixture of pity and terror. He was a man caught between a rock and a hard place, and he chose to save himself. "Elena," he stammered, avoiding her eyes, "please, collect your things. You're dismissed." The words hung in the suddenly silent dining room. Mr. Tanaka watched the scene with a detached, unreadable expression. Elena gave a single sharp nod. She placed the silver pitcher carefully on a nearby service stand, her hands perfectly steady. She did not look at Alistair. She did not look at Marcus. She simply turned to leave. This was not the reaction Alistair wanted. He needed a more satisfying conclusion to his power play. He wanted to see her break. "Not so fast," he called after her retreating form. Eleanor stopped, her back still to him. Alistair reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick alligator skin wallet. He extracted a wad of $100 bills, a stack thick enough to choke a horse, and threw it onto the table. The bills scattered across the white linen like fallen leaves. "Here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "for your troubles. A severance package. Go buy yourself a new life, one where you're not a complete and utter failure." It was the ultimate humiliation, an attempt to reduce her existence to a monetary transaction, a final stamp of his superiority. Elena slowly turned around. She looked at the money scattered on the table, then lifted her eyes to meet Alistair's. The stormy grey was now a flat, hard slate. There was no anger, no sadness, no fear. There was only a profound, unnerving emptiness that seemed to absorb his rage and reflect nothing back. "I don't want your money, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. She turned again and walked towards the staff entrance at the back of the restaurant, her posture as straight and unyielding as a queen's. The entire room watched her go, the silence thick with the residue of Alistair's cruelty. He was left sitting there, his grand gesture of dismissal rejected, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sting. He had won, but somehow he felt as if he had lost. The quiet dignity of the fired waitress had, in some inexplicable way, overshadowed his public display of dominance. And for a man like Alistair Finch, that was a failure far greater than a drop of spilled water. Alistair watched Elena's retreating back, a sour taste in his mouth. The clean victory he'd anticipated felt muddled. Her refusal of his money was a final, infuriating act of defiance. It was as if she, a nobody, had passed judgment on him and found him wanting. The eyes of Mr. Tanaka were on him, impassive and analytical. Alistair needed to reassert control, to erase the lingering stain of her quiet rebellion. He scoffed, forcing a dismissive laugh. "Some people," he announced to the table, though his voice was pitched for the whole room to hear, "don't know what's good for them. You offer them a lifeline and they spit in your face. The entitlement of the lower classes is truly astonishing." Marcus, the manager, scurried forward, eager to clean up the mess. "Again, Mr. Finch, my deepest apologies. We will be sending over our finest desserts, on the house, of course. And your entire bill for the evening will be taken care of." "See that it is," Alistair said, waving a dismissive hand. He wanted to project an air of boredom, as if the incident was already forgotten, a piece of lint he had brushed from his sleeve. But it wasn't. It gnawed at him. He wanted to be certain she was gone, not just from the restaurant, but from the building. He wanted her physically removed, an exclamation point on his sentence. He pulled out his phone, a sleek black device that connected him to his empire. He dialed his head of security, Gavin Reed. Reed was ex-Special Forces, a man of granite and quiet lethality, who managed Alistair's personal security detail. They were always close, stationed discreetly in vehicles outside whatever building Alistair occupied. "Reed, Alistair said into the phone, his voice low and sharp. "I have a situation here at Aurelia. There's some trash that needs to be taken out. A waitress, fired for incompetence. I want her escorted off the premises. Make sure she doesn't linger." There was a pause on the other end, then Reed's calm, professional voice. "Description, sir. Brown hair, plain face, black uniform. Name is Elena. She's heading for the staff exit now. I want to see her physically removed from the property. Make a point of it." "Understood, sir." The line went dead. Alistair placed his phone on the table with a satisfied click. This would be the final act. His personal, elite security team, men who looked like they could topple governments, arriving to escort a lowly waitress out onto the street. The optics were perfect. It was a display of overwhelming, disproportionate force that would not be lost on Mr. Tanaka. It was a statement. This is how I deal with problems, no matter how small. He settled back into his seat, picking up his wine glass and swirling the deep red liquid. "Now," he said, turning his full, charming attention back to his guests. "Where were we? Ah, yes, the logistics of the LNG transport from Qatar." He was launching back into his pitch when a new presence altered the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable. Two men entered through the main doors of Aurelia. They were not diners. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits that did nothing to hide the solid muscle beneath. Earpieces were coiled discreetly into their ears. Their eyes swept the room with a swift, practiced efficiency that missed nothing. They were followed by two more, and then a fifth man who was clearly the leader. It was Gavin Reed. Reed was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from rock and left out in the wind. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue. He moved with the coiled grace of a panther, every step silent and deliberate. His presence, and that of his team, immediately silenced the remaining whispers in the restaurant. These were not hotel security guards or bouncers, these were operators. The air crackled with their unspoken capability. Alistair felt a surge of pride. This was his power made manifest. He gave a subtle nod in Reed's direction, a king acknowledging his Praetorian guard. He expected Reed to nod back and then proceed to the back of the restaurant to carry out his orders. But Reed didn't look at him. His gaze swept the room and then locked onto the figure of Elena, who had just paused near the service door, seemingly waiting for something. A strange expression crossed Gavin Reed's face. It was a flicker, so fast that anyone else would have missed it. But Alistair, who prided himself on reading people, saw it clearly. It wasn't recognition in the normal sense. It was something deeper, more complex. It was shock, disbelief, and something else. Something that looked almost like reverence. Alistair frowned. What was this? "Reed," he called out, his voice sharp with impatience. "Over here, the woman by the door." He pointed a commanding finger at Elena. "That's the one. Get her out of my sight." Gavin Reed heard him. Alistair knew he did, but he gave no sign of it. He continued his slow, deliberate walk, not towards the staff exit, but directly into the center of the dining room. His team fanned out, creating a silent, intimidating perimeter. They weren't looking at the other diners as potential threats. They were creating a clear space, a stage. Reed's path was taking him directly towards Eleanor. Alistair leaned back, a smirk returning to his face. Good. A direct confrontation would be even more satisfying. He imagined Reed grabbing her by the arm, marching her out like a common criminal. But as Reed drew closer to Elena, his pace slowed. The hard, professional mask he always wore seemed to soften. He stopped about 10 feet away from her. Eleanor, who had been watching his approach, showed no fear. She simply waited, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. Every diner, every waiter, Marcus the manager, Mr. Tanaka and his associates, all were frozen, watching this bizarre, silent drama unfold. Alistair leaned forward, his brows furrowed in confusion. What is he waiting for? Reed, do your job. Gavin Reed ignored him. His focus was entirely on Elena. He stood at attention for a long moment, his posture ramrod straight. Then he gave his team a look. It wasn't a command, not in the traditional sense. It was a glance of shared understanding, of profound unspoken history. He gave a single, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. And then the impossible happened. In one smooth, synchronized, and utterly silent movement, Gavin Reed, the formidable ex-Special Forces commander, dropped to one knee. He was not falling, he was not stumbling, he was kneeling, his head bowed, his right fist coming to rest over his heart. And behind him, in perfect, chilling unison, his 4 team members did the exact same thing. 5 hardened elite security operatives, men who radiated danger and competence, were kneeling on the floor of a 5-star restaurant. They were not kneeling to Alistair Finch, their billionaire employer. They were kneeling to the fired waitress. The collective gasp from the room was a physical thing, a sudden rush of air. Alistair Finch stared, his mouth hanging open. The wine glass in his hand trembled, its contents sloshing precariously. The world had just tilted on its axis. The laws of physics, of power, of money had ceased to make sense. His mind struggled to process the image before him. His security chief, the man he paid a king's ransom to protect him, was bowing before the woman he had just publicly humiliated and fired. It was a scene of such profound contradiction that it felt like a hallucination. Then Gavin Reed's voice cut through the stunned silence. It was clear, respectful, and filled with an emotion Alistair had never heard from him before. "Ma'am," Reed said, his eyes fixed on the floor in front of Eleanor. "It is an honor. We did not know you were here." "Ma'am? An honor?" The words echoed in Alistair's skull, nonsensical and terrifying. He felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a hot, surging wave of confusion and rage. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Reed!" The sound that tore from his throat was not a word, but a raw, animalistic scream of disbelief. "What is the meaning of this? Get up, I said. I am your employer. I pay you. You work for me." His voice was shrill, cracking with a panic he couldn't control. He pointed a trembling finger, first at Reed, then at Elena. "What is going on? Who is she? Who is this nobody?" The security detail did not move. They remained kneeling, a silent, unbreachable wall of loyalty around the woman in the simple black uniform. They didn't even flinch at his screams. It was the most profound and terrifying act of insubordination Alistair had ever witnessed. It wasn't just that they were disobeying an order. They were acting as if he didn't even exist. His power, his money, his very identity as their commander had evaporated in an instant. Eleanor, the waitress, finally moved. She took a step towards the kneeling Gavin Reed. She looked down at him, and for the first time that evening, her face showed a clear emotion. It was not triumph. It was not arrogance. It was a deep, weary sadness, mingled with a reluctant resolve. "Rise, Gavin," she said, her voice soft, yet it carried an authority that dwarfed Alistair's frantic shrieks. "It's all right. You can rise." Slowly, gracefully, Gavin Reed and his men rose to their feet. They did not return to their aggressive security stances. Instead, they formed a protective semicircle behind Elena, facing outward, their bodies positioned between her and Alistair. They were no longer his guards. They were hers. Alistair Finch stood there, trembling, his face a mask of apoplectic fury and dawning horror. He had just tried to crush a fly, only to discover it was a dragon in disguise. And its loyal, fire-breathing guards were now staring right at him. The entire restaurant, his stage for a triumphant power play, had just become the scene of his own public, inexplicable, and catastrophic humiliation. The silence that followed Alistair's scream was a heavy, suffocating blanket. His words, his commands, his very identity as the man in charge had shattered against the wall of his own security team's deference to this woman. He stood, trembling, his mind a maelstrom of questions. Who was she? Why were they kneeling? What had he done? Mr. Tanaka watched, his face a perfectly neutral mask, but his eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. He was reassessing. The variables of his multi-billion-dollar equation had just been scrambled by an unknown quantity, and that quantity was currently standing calmly in the center of the room, flanked by 5 of the most dangerous-looking men he had ever seen. Eleanor finally turned her full attention to Alistair. The meek, invisible waitress was gone. The woman who faced him now was someone entirely different. Her posture had subtly shifted. Her shoulders were back, her chin was lifted, and her grey eyes, once carefully neutral, now held a chillingly direct and analytical gaze. It was the look of a commander assessing a tactical problem. "You asked who I am, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice even and devoid of emotion. "It's a fair question, given the circumstances. My name is Elena Petrova." The name meant nothing to Alistair. It was just a name. "Petrova?" he spat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I don't care if your name is Cleopatra. I want to know why my security chief is acting like you're the Queen of England." A faint, mirthless smile touched Elena's lips. "Not quite royalty, Mr. Finch, but in the world you've just blundered into, my name carries a certain weight." She gestured towards Gavin Reed. "Gavin, perhaps you could enlighten our former employer." Gavin Reed took half a step forward. He turned his head slightly to look at Alistair, and his pale blue eyes were as cold and unforgiving as a glacier. "Alistair Finch," Reed began, his voice a low, rumbling monotone. "You contracted the services of Aegis Global Security. You believed you were hiring the best private military and intelligence firm in the world. You were correct." "I know who I hired," Alistair snapped. "I pay your exorbitant fees every month." "You pay the corporation," Reed corrected him calmly. "You do not pay us. Our loyalty is not, and has never been, for sale. It belongs to the legacy and the bloodline of the man who founded Aegis Global, the man who trained us, led us, and on more than one occasion saved our lives. A man we respected not because of his wealth, but because of his character." A cold dread began to seep into Alistair's bones. He was beginning to understand, but his mind refused to accept the implications. Reed continued, his voice resonating with deep, unshakable conviction. "The founder of Aegis Global was General Ivan Petrov." The name hit Alistair like a physical blow. General Petrov, the Ghost Commander, a legendary figure in the shadowy world of international special operations, a strategic genius who had retired from the military to create the most elite and sought-after private security force on the planet. Alistair had never met him. The general had reportedly died in a tragic hiking accident a little over a year ago. But his reputation was the entire reason Aegis Global was so revered. "General Ivan Petrov," Reed repeated, letting the name hang in the air. "One of the finest soldiers and men of honor this world has ever known." He paused, then turned his gaze back to Elena. "And this is his daughter, Elena Petrova." The room seemed to spin. Elena Petrova, the sole heir to the Petrov name and presumably the Aegis Global Empire. The woman he had just called incompetent trash. The woman he had tried to humiliate by throwing money at her. The woman he had ordered his own men, her father's men, to throw out like garbage. He stared at her, really seeing her for the first time. The plain features, the severe bun, the simple uniform, it was a disguise, a perfect camouflage. He had looked at her and seen a servant, a non-entity, because that was all his world view allowed him to see. He had never once considered that she could be anything more. But that's impossible," Alistair stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She's a waitress." "A role I took on for a very specific reason," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through his daze. "My father's death was ruled an accident. I never believed it. He was the most careful man I have ever known. He did not simply fall from a mountain trail he had hiked 100 times. She took a step closer, and Alistair instinctively took a step back. After his death, she continued, the company's board was taken over by a group of his former business partners. Men my father had begun to distrust, men who prioritized profit above all else. The company's financials started to look creative, and one client's name kept appearing, associated with increasingly risky and morally ambiguous operations. Your name, Mr. Finch. Alistair felt a jolt of pure panic. That's absurd. My dealings with Aegis are perfectly legitimate. Are they? Elena's gaze was sharp, piercing. I needed to get close to you, to observe you without you ever knowing I was there. I needed to understand your operations, the people you met with, the deals you made. What better way than to become part of the furniture? A waitress at your favorite restaurant, a place where you conduct your most sensitive business. It's amazing what you can overhear when people assume you are beneath their notice. She glanced over at Mr. Tanaka's table. Like this merger, for instance. A brilliant move on the surface. But I've had my father's loyalists within Aegis's intelligence division looking into your finances for months. This deal isn't about expansion, is it, Mr. Finch? It's about leveraging Tanaka-san's legitimate capital to hide the fact that your company is a house of cards, on the verge of a catastrophic collapse due to massive systemic fraud. Mr. Tanaka's eyes widened slightly. He looked from Elena to Alistair, his expression finally shifting from neutral curiosity to cold, hard calculation. "She is lying," Alistair shouted, his voice high and strained. "This is insane. A conspiracy." "Is it?" Elena countered smoothly. She held up her left hand, and for the first time Alistair noticed a simple, plain-looking silver ring on her finger. She twisted the bezel. "Gavin, the file, please." One of the other security men, a hulking figure with a shaved head, stepped forward. He held a slim black tablet. He tapped the screen and it came to life, displaying a complex series of charts, bank transfers, and encrypted communications. He handed it to Gavin, who in turn presented it to Mr. Tanaka. "Tanaka-san," Eleanor said, her tone respectful but firm, "I believe you will find this illuminating. It is a full breakdown of Mr. Finch's offshore accounts, his shell corporations, and the true leverage debt of his company. The very debt he intended to bury within your corporation's assets through this merger. My team finished compiling it 30 minutes ago. All I was waiting for was confirmation of your final meeting." Mr. Tanaka took the tablet. His eyes, sharp and quick, scanned the screen. He scrolled through pages of data, his expression growing darker with every passing second. The blood drained from Alistair's face. He knew what was on that tablet. It was his entire criminal enterprise laid bare. "Your arrogance, Mr. Finch, was your downfall," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You were so busy playing the king that you never thought to check if the servants were listening. You threw a tantrum over a drop of water, and in doing so, you forced my hand. You turned your little stage into my own." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You didn't just spill water tonight, Mr. Finch. You capsized your entire world." Alistair Finch's world was not just capsized, it was shattered, sinking into an abyss he hadn't even known existed. The tablet in Mr. Tanaka's hands was a death sentence. The Japanese businessman, after a few moments of intense, silent reading, placed the device gently on the table. He stood up, a man of immense dignity, and adjusted his suit jacket. He did not look at Alistair. He looked only at Elena. He bowed. Not a shallow nod of the head, but a deep, formal bow of profound respect. "Petrova-san," Mr. Tanaka said, his voice clear and precise, "it seems I owe you a great debt. You have saved my company from a disastrous entanglement. The proposed merger is, of course, terminated." He then turned his gaze to Alistair, and it was filled with a contempt so cold it was almost tangible. "Finch-san, you are a dishonorable man. We will have no further contact." With that, he signaled to his associates. They rose, bowed to Elena as well, and then followed their leader as he walked briskly out of the restaurant, leaving Alistair alone in the wreckage. The deal was dead. His last lifeline was gone. Alistair felt his legs weaken, and he sank back into his chair. His mind was racing, trying to find an angle, an escape route. There was none. He was cornered. "You can't prove any of this," he rasped, a pathetic attempt at a bluff. "It's all fabricated data. I'll sue you. I'll sue Aegis. I'll ruin you." Eleanor almost laughed. The sound was without humor. "Sue us? Mr. Finch, you seem to be under a misapprehension. You are no longer a client of Aegis Global. As the majority shareholder, a fact I was able to solidify last week using the voting proxies my father left me, I am exercising my right to terminate our contract with you, effective immediately." She made a small gesture with her hand. "Gavin," she said, "Mr. Finch is now a civilian. He no longer requires our protection." The words hit Alistair harder than any physical blow. His security, his shield against a world of rivals and enemies. Gone, just like that. The 5 men standing around him were no longer his protectors. They were now just 5 men who clearly despised him. "You can't do this," he whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a rising tide of terror. "I already have," Eleanor replied, "and I'm not finished." She pulled out a small, unassuming cell phone, different from the one Alistair had seen her use before. She dialed a single number from memory. It rang once before someone answered. "It's me," she said into the phone, her voice now possessing a hard military edge. "The Finch situation is resolved. He's compromised. The data package is secure and has been delivered to the interested party." She listened for a moment, then continued, "Yes, he's here. Uncooperative, but contained." Another pause. "No, the authorities are not required. This is an internal matter. Your asset is compromised, and my father's name has been tarnished by association. That requires a more direct form of arbitration." Arbitration. The word sent a fresh spike of ice through Alistair's veins. It was corporate jargon, but in this context, spoken by this woman, it sounded like a death knell. She wasn't talking about lawyers and courtrooms. "Send the cleanup crew," Eleanor concluded. "Aurelia restaurant. They'll know what to do." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. A cleanup crew. The phrase hung in the air, pregnant with unspoken menace. Alistair stared at her, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated fear. The arrogant billionaire was gone, replaced by a terrified man who had just realized he had picked a fight with a power far beyond his comprehension. He had insulted the daughter of a legend, and in doing so had summoned the full, terrifying weight of that legend's world down upon his own head. He looked around the silent restaurant. The other diners were staring, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. The manager, Marcus, was hiding behind the bar, peeking over the counter like a frightened rabbit. Eleanor walked over to the table and picked up the scattered $100 bills Alistair had thrown down. She held the thick wad of cash in her hand. She didn't count it. She walked back to Alistair, who flinched as she approached. She leaned down, her face close to his, and spoke in a voice so low only he could hear. "You wanted to give me a severance package, Mr. Finch. You wanted me to buy a new life." She pressed the wad of cash into the pocket of his expensive suit jacket. "Allow me to return the favor. You're going to need it for yours." She straightened up and turned to leave. Gavin Reed and his team moved with her, a phalanx of silent, loyal guards. As they reached the door, she paused and looked back over her shoulder, not at Alistair, but at the trembling manager. "Marcus," she said, her voice returning to a normal, conversational tone, "my apologies for the disruption to your dining room. Please send a bill for any damages to Aegis Global Headquarters, and do make sure my final paycheck is mailed to the address on file. I believe I have 2 weeks' wages due." And with that, she was gone. The doors of Aurelia swung shut behind her and her men, leaving behind a silent restaurant, a dead multi-billion-dollar deal, and one utterly broken billionaire, sitting alone at his table, waiting for the cleanup crew. The aftermath in Aurelia was like the silence after a lightning strike. The air was still charged. The image of the kneeling security team and the cold fury of Elena Petrova burned into the memory of every person present. Alistair Finch remained slumped in his chair, a man hollowed out. The Tom Ford suit now looked like a costume on a mannequin, the Patek Philippe on his wrist a meaningless circle of metal. His power, which he had always believed was an intrinsic part of his being, had been revealed as a fragile illusion, easily stripped away. He stared at the empty doorway through which Eleanor had departed. The finality of her actions was absolute. Terminating his security contract wasn't just a business decision. It was a strategic move that left him utterly exposed. For years, he had operated with the supreme confidence that Aegis Global made him untouchable. He had made powerful enemies, cut corners, and ruined lives, all under the impenetrable shield of General Petrov's legacy. Now that shield was not only gone, it had been turned against him. The quiet hum of the restaurant began to return, but it was different now. The other patrons, members of the city's elite, were whispering. They weren't looking at him with envy or admiration anymore. They were looking at him with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, like spectators at the scene of a spectacular crash. His social currency, built over a decade of ruthless ambition, had just been rendered worthless. News of this night would spread through their circles like wildfire. By morning, Alistair Finch would be a cautionary tale. His mind replayed Eleanor's final words. "Send the cleanup crew. They'll know what to do." It was a threat veiled in corporate ambiguity, and that made it all the more terrifying. Who were they? What would they do? He imagined men in dark suits arriving not to escort him, but to make him disappear. The world Elena and her father inhabited was one of shadows and consequences, a world with a different, more permanent set of rules. A sudden primal fear, an emotion he hadn't truly felt since he was a child, gripped him. He had to get out. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. He had other security options, less prestigious firms he could call. He had lawyers, fixers, people who could be bought. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like jelly. He managed to push himself up, leaning heavily on the table. He had to escape before this clean-up crew arrived. He stumbled away from the table, ignoring the stairs. His only thought to get to his car, to get somewhere safe, though he had no idea where that might be. As he reached the restaurant's grand entrance, the doors swung open. Two men entered. They were not dressed in the tactical gear of Aegis operatives. They wore simple, well-tailored but unremarkable grey suits. They were of average height and build, with faces that were instantly forgettable. They looked like accountants or mid-level bureaucrats. But they moved with a synchronized purpose, and their eyes, cold and empty, scanned the room and found Alistair instantly. One of them held up a wallet, flipping it open to show a badge. It wasn't a police badge. It was something Alistair didn't recognize, an emblem of some clandestine government agency that operated without public oversight. The SEC, the FBI, they would have been a relief. This was something else entirely. "Alistair Finch?" the first man asked. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. It was not a question. Alistair froze, his hand on the door. Who are you?" "We've been asked to escort you to a secure location to discuss some financial irregularities that have come to our attention," the second man said, his tone just as neutral. "It would be in your best interest to come with us quietly." This was Elena's cleanup crew, not thugs, but something far worse. They were the system, the invisible machinery of power that men like him paid fortunes to avoid. Elena hadn't sent killers, she had sent auditors from hell. She wasn't just taking away his freedom, she was going to systematically dismantle his entire life, piece by painstaking piece, under the cold, fluorescent lights of an interrogation room. Defeated, Alistair's shoulders slumped. There was no fight left in him. He gave a single, pathetic nod. The two men flanked him, their presence both unassuming and utterly inescapable. They guided him out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, towards a black sedan with tinted windows that waited at the curb. As the door closed behind him, Alistair Finch, the titan of industry, vanished from the world he had once ruled. His spectacular downfall, witnessed by a roomful of people he had tried so desperately to impress. His reign had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a car door. Miles away, Elena Petrova stood in a darkened office high above the city. It had been her father's office, and she hadn't changed a thing. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco still lingered in the air. A large portrait of General Ivan Petrov in his full dress uniform hung on the wall, his eyes seeming to follow her. Gavin Reed stood by the window, looking down at the river of headlights flowing through the city streets. "The package is secure," Gavin reported. "The arbitrators have him. They'll unravel his entire network. It will be quiet, efficient. By the time they're done, it will be as if he never existed." Elena nodded, her reflection a faint silhouette against the panoramic view. She was no longer wearing the Waitress uniform. She had changed into a simple black dress, elegant and severe. The hair was still in a bun, but it no longer looked plain. It looked practical, purposeful. "He thought because I was serving him, I was beneath him," she said, her voice a low murmur. "My father always told me that true power is never loud. It's quiet, it's patient, and it's always underestimated. People like Finch mistake noise for strength." She walked over to her father's large oak desk and ran her hand over the cool, polished surface. This was her legacy, not just the money or the company, but the loyalty of men like Gavin, the code of honor her father had instilled in them, the very name that had made a team of elite soldiers kneel. What he did tonight, the humiliation, the arrogance, it wasn't just an attack on me as a waitress, she continued, her voice hardening slightly. It was an insult to everything my father built. He used Aegis as a tool for his own greed, tarnishing a name that was once synonymous with honor. Tonight, we began to clean the slate. Gavin turned from the window. The board members who sided with Finch are already being investigated. Your consolidation of the shares was the final piece. You have full control now, Eleanor. The company is yours. Ours, Gavin, she corrected him gently. It belongs to all of us who still remember what it was meant to stand for. She looked up at her father's portrait, a sad smile touching her lips. Her investigation into his death was far from over. Finch was just a symptom of the disease that had infected her father's company. He was a greedy, arrogant fool, and his spectacular downfall had served a vital purpose. It was a message. It was a declaration to the remaining snakes in the boardroom and to the world at large that a Petrova was once again in command. The quiet, invisible waitress was gone for good. In her place stood the new head of Aegis Global, a woman forged in grief, tested by fire, and armed with a legacy of unshakable loyalty. Her war was just beginning, and she would wage it from the shadows, just as her father had taught her. She would be quiet, she would be patient, and she would be perpetually lethally underestimated, her father's legacy now safely in her hands.